you let you folks lead us into the conversation.
Well, thank you, Chris. So they're going to start off. I'm going to ask a few questions of Barbara, and that usually responds with her turning the questions back on me, since to have a conversation about race does imply that it requires people from more than one racial background to be part of the conversation. So that's always a good starting point. Now, the first question, before we get on to really asking Barbara about the book, we thought that we'd like to dive into an actual conversation around one of those topics that people often sort of are nervous around, and it's particularly around the use of language. And when we were preparing for this, we remembered back in 2017, when we first started working together, that we got off to a slightly tricky start, because I, for all sorts of good reasons, having read up on Barbara and had a look at her sort of profile and these sorts of things, I said to Barbara, well, actually, I find you quite intimidating. And this landed in an unexpected way for me. So, Barbara, if you could give a little bit of the responses to why it landed the way it did with you.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, John? Because, you know, you and I, we're sitting comfortably. You say something that is perfectly normal in your world, and it lands in my world as a Black woman when someone talks about me being intimidating. You know, I don't know if you realize this, but when you say something like intimidating or aggressive to a Black woman, and particularly a Black woman that you may not know so well, and I can't speak on behalf of all Black women here, so just be aware of that as I'm saying it, that's how it landed with me in that moment. It was quite hurtful, actually, and it felt quite offensive. And, you know, the reason I think it felt like that is it's about, those words are often used when you want to quieten down and silence Black women in particular, because it's a way of managing our tone. It's almost as if it's to say that, you know, Black women or Black people generally, we're not allowed to get excited. We're not allowed to express ourselves in loud, overt ways. We need to be quietened down. And I guess what was also sitting with me at that time, John, was where a lot of that comes from. And often there's a lack of knowledge as to where that comes from. A lot of this sits in old tropes around what Black people should be, tropes around how Black women should behave. So the old mammy trope, you know, the Black woman is the carer, so she can't step out of that role and be assertive. So whilst it was a comment, it landed with me in a place that says, here we go again. I've heard this so many times before, and now here I am with somebody new, and he uses that word. And afterwards I thought, he just used the word. So from your world, how did it feel from where you were sitting, John?
Well, I was just, even though we've in a sense, we've had this conversation many times since then, I just noticed how much of an emotional reaction I had to when you used the words hurtful and offensive there. And I noticed within me a sort of a defensive bristle, even after all these years. Oh, no, that's not what I meant. And I was just like, gosh, even though we've been through that gut reaction in me is still there. So that, you know, how you then, the whole conversation, you could imagine spiraling into, you know, dialogues of silence and, you know, defensive reactions. So that I was very struck by, gosh, when you, even with you in your very, you know, as you say in your book, you know, softening and those sorts of things, suddenly certain words were a real jolt to me. And I think it is a real jolt to people when they realize that quite what they're evoking in the other. And it's a shame response, of course. So that was me. So we're going to move on. So I'm going to do some clunky gear changes on this. And it builds on this, because you recently got interviewed for a well-known journal in the sort of the ODHR arena. And they took a phrase you used and slapped it into the headline. And this really got on your goat again. And the phrase was, and they gave it as the headline for the whole piece, it's so exhausting trying to please white people. Could you just say quite why the way that they use what you'd said really got under your skin?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, and you and I have had a conversation about this, that I gave an interview to, as you said, a very well-known magazine. And I did use those words during the interview. I did use the words at one stage during the interview. Actually, it is quite exhausting trying to please white people. I was then somewhat astonished to find that that was the headline that they'd chosen to draw people into the article. So whereas for me, the article was about being open to having a positive conversation about race, they picked up on this idea, oh, poor Black people, it's so exhausting for them trying to please white people, or certainly that was the way that I interpreted it. And for me, that was also to do with power. There was a whole thing there, wasn't it, about power, you know, it's Black people trying to please white people. We're in that slightly more superior position. That was how it came across to me. It also struck me that having read my book, which the person had read it, why would they pick that out when this book was about Black people being unapologetic about the ways in which they navigate race at work? It wasn't about Black people putting themselves down, about having to try to please the other. This was more, let's accept this is the context, this is the world within which we work and live, but work in particular as Black people. This is the world. We will adapt as necessary. It's not about us trying to please them. So I guess when I read that headline, firstly, again, gonna have to, this is gonna be the overused word of the morning, I was hurt. And actually, I was quite angry. And my response was to ask them to pull the article. And they did indeed pull the article, and they changed the headline in the online version. And I think, John, the two things that we've talked about are both in the world of microaggressions. They both sit, whether it's around intimidating, whether it's taking things like that out of context in a way that perhaps oversimplify the issue. They both sit in that world of saying things which are unintentionally hurtful, harmful, and put, in my case, all Black people, all Black women into a certain category. And, you know, one of the things when we talk about having conversations, and, you know, we'll talk about this later, John, but there is something, isn't there, about how we educate ourselves on some of the basics around things like microaggressions and what they might look like for people who are different to ourselves.
I'm going to ask you in a few. I'm going to respond to some of the things that got that evoked for me shortly. But in terms, so you know what the question I'm going to tee you up for in a second is actually to shift you onto the book itself, and particularly around, you know, why the book and why now. But the things that I was really picking up from listening to you there was first of all, you know, this whole notion that words create worlds, and the Sartre observation that words are like loaded revolvers. And as soon as we think there is such thing as an objective or neutral way of talking about the world, we're going to walk into a world of pain, because it's such, you know, understanding the subjective nature of language is a really important requirement. And so much of our public discourse wants to avoid how dynamic language is, and how much, you know, the more we pay attention to it, the more we have the opportunity to create new worlds and new ways of relating and connecting with each other. And just then, the other thing was building on to that, and then linking into the thing about your book and why now, was, you know, the thing that I really took away, you know, the book, you said, if I remember, is aimed at, particularly at white leaders, white managers. And you said your framing was, you know, let us stop treating Black people as a problem, and also, can we stop vilifying white people? And that whole, and I suppose that's part of the headline that you was critiquing. Can we stop this splitting and actually explore how can we build, you know, robust, relational, you know, vibrant connections with people who come from different racial experiences or race-informed experience. So with that from me, probably said a little bit, can you now tell us about the book and why you, both personally and professionally, had to write it, and why now?
Yes, so why the book, as yeah, and why now? So, you know, I've been, I know a lot. The reason I know a lot of you here in the room is because I've been in the world of working with strategy, working with leadership, working with change for many, many years. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's there around leadership. There's a lot of stuff that's there about change, a lot of stuff that's there about strategy. And if I ever want to find any language, any information, any concepts around those topics, they're there. I can find them. When I look to think about race, and in particular, the Black British experience and race, I couldn't find anything. There were no books that conceptualized it. There were no books that talked about the lived experiences of Black people. So that was one reason why I wanted to write the book. So this connecting of race and leadership was really important to me. And as I've said, that, you know, I've worked in this world for many, many years, and I've often thought, there is so much about me, about my life, that I would like others to know, and about the lives of Black people, that would help them in the conversations they're having around race. A lot of those conversations happen because they are uninformed. People don't understand the history. People don't understand the background. There's not an understanding of the lived experience of the other. So that was another reason why I wanted to write the book. And, you know, a third reason, there are lots of reasons, you know, a third reason is that, you know, I've got 3 daughters. 2 of them have entered into the workplace. So they're in their mid-20s, they're now in the workplace, and they are having to have some of the same experiences around race and difference that I had 30 years ago, sadly. And I thought it would be great to have something that they could give to their line manager, often their white managers, and I'm using black, white here in very essentialist terms, in a way that would help them to understand them and help them engage in a positive conversation with them around race. And, you know, there is something about the right time. It just happened to be around the Floyd time when I started writing the book. So for all those reasons, and also, John, and that I will stop, partly because I feel I'm towards the end of my career. I'm not sure I could have written this book earlier. Would I have got the work that I wanted to get if I'd opened up, had this degree of self-disclosure, and talked about a topic that's so knotty, so challenging?
And we talked about that stage of life thing, and that whole sort of if not now, when. And there is a certain freedom that comes when you're at the senior end of one's career. I was trying to find a good way of describing that. And that sense of, actually, there is very little downside to speaking up at this point, because you've got your professional reputation. It will never sort of go away. And you are the one, and we are the ones, and I want to say we are the ones who can begin to name this, can begin to model that robust conversation, because we have that responsibility. You know, if we're not going to put this right, you know, quite frankly, then that's a dereliction of duty. And so that's why I'm so pleased to be, you know, working with you on this. Now, I want to just shift now onto the actual title. So can you just say something? You call it The Model Black, and during the various conversations we've had and during some of the workshops we've been in with groups, we talked about the model black, and within the book you talk about the militant black, but we've also come out more and more about the whole notion of tempered radicals, and that whole point of people who act as that bridge between not rocking the boat and actively rocking the boat. So could you just say a bit more about that relationship between model black, militant black, and tempered radical?
Yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, so the book is called The Model Black, and the idea is that the model black, I almost want it to be a positive new trope around Black people. And what I mean by that is the model Black is the Black person who identifies what they need to do within the work environment, and is constantly adapting to that, constantly navigating that environment. So the model Black in many ways is it's a de facto, it's a description of how Black people get on. It's not a checklist for how Black people should get on. And I wouldn't want it to be that. This is what they have to do to get on. And it's not like this for all Black people, but there's the sense that, you know, the model Black softens. The model Black realizes it's probably best more often to shut up and not challenge or not even enter into a conversation around race. You know, the model Black knows that, you know, there are benefits in being much more like the white majority culture. So that's what the model Black is. The model Black is someone who scans the environment, and I use scan in a different way, and says, what is it I need to do to get on, even if that might mean giving up large bits of myself. So this isn't about me. This is about giving up parts of myself to be what I need to be successful. And, you know, as we've talked about it, John, in the last chapter of the book, I'm in conversation with my brother, and my brother, who's a university professor, is very much the militant Black. Always foregrounds his race, always picks people out when they say anything that's negative or anything that is any vague kind of microaggression. So that would be the militant Black, the one that says, no, I'm not going to tolerate this. And the one who, as I said, speaks up probably on every occasion. And you're right, what we need, don't we, is something that's somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle where, as you've said, there's a possibility to speak out, to challenge people in a way that's positive and helpful, and doesn't then result in them feeling, you know, that, you know, or, you know, evoking this thing that we call white fragility. So you're right. How do we create that middle space is really something that I want people to start to think about, having read the book.
This wasn't one of the planned questions. Somebody's just popped an interesting comment in the chat, which I want is, and I think this would be worth running with Barbara if you're up for it. So somebody's put in a comment which is, speaking up isn't militancy, it's assertiveness. Now I'm interesting. Actually, what that evoked in me is that actually often speaking up is quite a radical act, because it's often naming something which has not been named, or someone is naming something which this person normally doesn't name. So to me, that was what my instant response to that observation. Barbara, what was your response to it?
Speaking up isn't militancy. Yeah, I'm going to give you one of those consultants' responses. It depends, doesn't it? Because if you're speaking up where there is a power dynamic, and the person who you're speaking up to has some power over your career, has some power over your progression within the organization, and you are then labeled or perceived to be a militant, that works against you. So there is a whole contextual piece to it. So every kind, I wouldn't say every kind of speaking up is militancy, of course it isn't, but there is often a sense that if I speak up, what label will I then be given? When I challenge, and regardless of how I challenge, you know, I recall very early in my career, asking someone, could I just have a quiet word with you? And then I expressed that, you know, doing the usual thing, separating intention from impact. You know, maybe you didn't intend to do that when you said that, but that was the impact it had on me. And as I say in the book, I was labeled forever as PC Banda. It was politically correct Banda. That was who I was. I became the problem. So I think in a purely theoretical context, no, it isn't militancy. In the real life worlds of hierarchical organizations, sadly, it can become militancy.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to sort of close off this debate, but I want to just read the response from the person who did that. And I just want to get that on the record. So the phrase they put into the chat is, radicalism isn't militancy either. Its very definition is basic. We can't take on others' characterizations of us. Which I think would be, we could run an entire seminar on that. So very thought-provoking. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Yes.
What I'm going to ask now is a question that I asked in one of our previous podcasts, it's naming the very reality of the dynamic of the two of us speaking together, and it is this whole question of how do you feel? What's your experience? I'm expecting you to play the question back to me as well. What's your experience of being interviewed by someone like me? I am, white establishment male. What are you paying attention to? What's it evoking in you as an experience in a public forum?
Yeah, and I think, this is multi-layered, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I know you, John, and I know you've read the book. So there is something that brings us to a different place. But there is something for me, I think, talking to someone like yourself, that you are peeling back layers of yourself. You're disclosing parts of yourself, for me, that I wouldn't typically talk about to someone like yourself. I wouldn't talk about some of the experiences I've had that perhaps have in some way caused trauma in my life, in a way that, I feel I'm peeling away layers and hoping that you'll get it. Hoping that I won't get a response that says, oh, that's not what I meant. Actually, that's not what I intended, Barbara. But hoping that I'll get a response that says, tell me some more. Let me understand a bit more of that. Yeah, so questions that might open up. So I guess that's how that's probably my primary emotion, John. And how do you feel in this? Yeah, what's your sense?
Well, it is, and it's despite, again, knowing you well and in a sense having a strong personal affection as much as a professional one. But even so, in a forum where there are other voices and I'm aware of things in the chat room, I am terrified at one level of getting it wrong. So again, any form of human interconnection, it's hanging on to that there is some sort of perfect relationship that I should be aiming for, rather than, as in any human relationship, it has its robustness. You're sort of working out how it goes along. At some level, I'm hanging on to the idea that there is some sort of perfection. There is some sort of ideal template. And what then gets, I think now, just thinking absolutely out loud, is I disappear you as the individual and I start seeing you just as the label. And it's at that point where I think I need to catch myself approaching you as label, not as person. Yeah. And actually the idea that there is, and the whole cult of the perfectibility, that's playing in my head.
And John, and what could I say? I'm really curious then about what would you want to hear from me to make you feel that it's okay to be wrong, or it's okay that you've not said the right thing? What would you want to hear? Because
well, it's actually, you did it when we were talking about when we were sort of talking about the intimidating, right at the start of this. It's this idea of actually you presented it in quite a soft way. Actually, you presented it more boldly, I think, than when we talked about it in private. And it is the way that you invite me to be curious rather than invite me to defend. And there's something about the way that you don't go on to, well, I'm not surprised to hear that from you. You don't go into a painting me into a corner. You don't shame me for my lack of life experience, which means that I haven't had the empathetic experience of what it's like to walk in your shoes. Yeah. And at the same time, you phrase it in a way that wants me to become curious about walking in your shoes. And I just think of some of the stories you've told, and I can't remember whether it was in the book or not, about when you had a Saturday job, I think, working in Tesco's when you were about 16. And it was when you said, you're very happy to have the job. And I think that's really good, 16 out there, earning some cash. And then you said, and then you were told, oh, by the way, you can't work on the meat counter because the customers won't like it. They won't want you handling things. And that's when my jaw dropped to my sense of, geez, now that's a life. And it was the way that you blended the ordinary and the extraordinary at the same time. And so you were able to connect with, oh, I remember being a teenager, first job, first pay packet, and that feeling that it gets. And then it combined with, and then you had this layer of experience, which I just didn't have.
Yeah, that's quite that. Thank you for that, John. And I think that's so interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that I say is that the book is written for a white audience. It's not written for a black audience, because what will black people who've read the book will say, well, yeah, so yeah, lots of things like that have happened to me. This isn't a lot of the stuff in there. I've not shared it yet with a black person who's been surprised. So the whole point of that is so it's warming to me to hear that, having read that, you're now seeing things differently. Perhaps when you clearly each black person is individual, but when you come to that conversation, you may come with a sense of, there's a whole load of life experience behind that person that I may not have anticipated. And I think that's part of the invitation of the book, or might not be about.
And I was also just checking in the chat there, and there was some, I think this one read, I think there's something here about creating a safe space for both parties to have a conversation. And I just remember, I think some of our early conversations happened in cafes. And I remember it was one which employed a lot of people with learning disabilities in the who were all the waiting staff and everything. And so there's something about being in an environment where one was actually immediately attuned to very different life experiences. And it felt like that was a very safe place to begin to pay attention to things that either you ignore or pretend aren't there. So I think, what constitutes a safe space is an interesting one.
Yeah, and I've just add to that as well, because John, I think there is a couple of, I think, yes, there's a safe space. And I think there is your openness, because, it's something we can't control, can we, sometimes, which is the willingness of the other to engage. And I think there is, from your part, a real willingness to come with me and, to be part of it, and to say, to be, I use the word, to be humble, in the sense that there is stuff that I don't know about, in the same way that when we work with strategy, change, leadership, there's stuff I don't know about. So my experience is often that, people find it easier in those other areas. They find it harder when it comes to things around race in particular. And I think that helped a lot. There was something that you brought that said, I'm ready, I'm willing, I'm open, I'm listening.
I was just being reminded of that's a particular tutor of mine at some point saying, the more you know about a subject, the more you realize you don't know. And it's that once you start engaging with this, and I think that's part of what gets you over the hurdle of being right, is that actually when you realize the sheer complexity of the situation, you realize I'm never going to be right on this. But actually you suddenly realize, blimey, so many other aspects of my understanding of the world. I'm very conscious if I listen to a lot of history and the way that sort of, let's say, the history of the British Empire is being explored. And suddenly, things that I'd been taught at A level and these sorts of things, I'm just thinking, blimey, that was such a particular way of presenting the past. And again, it's realizing how much of the British historical past plays out. So I have a military father. He was a colonel in the army. He was off doing in colonial wars, and I was just thinking, and I was with a Ugandan friend yesterday, and he was talking about how his grandfather was, had connections in the King's Royal Rifles or something, and you just think about this mishmash of so many experiences which then play out within the race conversation. And I find it, as you can see from my sort of energy, and it's really interesting to realize how little you know, and how all this history is playing out right now between the conversation of you and me.
Yes, and yes, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that understanding of the context, understanding how we've got here is quite important. I mean, I don't talk history in the book. I touch a little bit on tropes, because those tropes have their bases in history as well. So, and John, just as we're talking, there's also another comment that has come in from in the chat box there, which is I think something you and I have touched on before, because this idea that white people need to become comfortable with that discomfort. Yeah, because Black people, as it says here, are used to being in situations where they feel discomfort and fear, but cannot choose to disengage. You know, so back a little bit to that often some kind of spoken or unspoken power dynamic. So there's all the stuff that you've said about the history that's always present, and then there's what's present in that moment, isn't there? That, you know, the choices that each party has, and recognizing those choices are different depending on whether you are Black or white in that particular situation.
I'm really struck by that choice of engage or disengage, because I just realized, particularly in so many of these sort of, you know, relatively elite circles that I pop along into, I can move back into a normative mainstream where I can almost switch my attentive radar off, because I just, you know, I can just busk, because I don't have to pay attention to the same extent. Whereas if I come from a marginalized perspective, or people who are always on that, you know, from a power point of view, if you come from a marginal perspective, you are always more attentive to what other people are doing. The more you are associated with the core of the power tradition, the more that actually it's just comfortable. You're not having to put on a garb or anything, because it's in your DNA. And it's you know, there are large chunks of my life where I can go off and feel easy, and it's realizing that that's available to me in a way that it isn't for other people.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the time on this, and I'm going to sort of return to one of the questions that we thought we were going to address, and it's to do with what enables people to find their voice. I mean, we touched on it right at the start, you know, stage of career, but what would you recommend? I mean, I know you've got a sophisticated book, and we don't agree with the language of top tips or anything reductive like that, but what are your top tips for people to find their voice, whether they're a white person or a Black person, to begin a conversation and to encourage such a conversation?
I mean, I often say it's helpful if you've both, it's not just because I've written a book, but if you've both read something that you can talk about. I often find that's a really helpful starting point, whether it is, look, here's an article that I found on microaggressions, let's talk about it. So some other starting point that is often not between the two of you. So some article, something that you can read and discuss. I found that's a helpful way for each person to then start to find their voice. So that's, a helpful way. There is something, I think, and we all talk about it, don't we? This psychological safety piece, and it's come up again here, hasn't it, in the chat box, which is, what is it that you say to the other to enable them? How is it that you demonstrate that curiosity? I'm really interested in understanding, in understanding more about whatever it is. I'd be really interested to understand a bit more about your family, even if it's on that very, very basic level. And to be honest with you, no one's ever said that to me in my work life. No one's ever said, I'd be really interested to know about your family. I'm really curious to know about, you went to the cinema at the weekend, or, what was it you watched at the weekend? There's never a sense that what I do, or there's often, let's not say never. So I think what would be helpful would be coming from a point of view, and maybe this comes from both sides, yet that actually there is something different about you that I need to be open to, and I need to ask it in a way that allows the space for you to allow us both to explore that.
And you use the D word, difference. And again, I'm just thinking about the way that the corporate framing for about the last 30, 40 years has all been about homogenization and similarities. And let's emphasize and actually, how do we walk towards difference? How do we notice difference? And it's, it's news of difference, as Gregory Bates say is the underpinning of learning. And it's really appreciating it and say, gosh, we must have some differences here. We should explore those. And again, it's from the position of curiosity and understanding. And I'm just thinking I'm looking at the time. I'm going to ask one last question of you, Barbara. And it's, I'm also just looking at the chat, by the way, I'm getting very distracted by that. And which actually reminded me of one other thing I was saying, is somebody said that, people don't always have the time to read. But actually, one of the things we found from sharing things like these podcasts are actually quite effective. So we know of one particular setting where they watched a recording, the two of us chatting, and we know that enabled a shift in the conversation between a manager and a staff member. So this is a very low-key, interesting way for people to actually come together around a topic which isn't about them directly, because they can explore, how did Barbara and John talk about this? When did you notice it really flew? When did you notice it getting a bit sticky? And then they can connect it to their own lives. So again, they're using all sorts of media to do these things. So my last question is, Barbara, we've both like tilting at windmills, and we want to sort of make a difference in the world. How do you want to see both your book and your work and our work in this area making a difference?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing and I'm going to say, the first thing is, I want there to be positive conversations around race. This isn't about, as we said, there is no victim in this, or I don't want that to be the mindset that people enter into those conversations. So there's something about having positive conversations. That's something I say over and over again. So that's what I would like. I would love people to read the chapters. A lot of the book is about the Black experience, and then there are chapters about what white people can do. There's a whole load of resources in there. If you don't know what to read, turn to the book and have a look. Just there's lots of resources in there. So I think that's very helpful. And what I would like to happen in organizations is just that we get to the stage where the ways in which, somebody's put something in the chat about women, the ways in which we now talk about women, the openness with which we now feel we can talk about women and the differences around women and having targets around women and the challenges around women, we haven't got there yet. But wouldn't it be great if we got even a little bit further along that dial, along that route in relation to the ways in which we talk about race? And for me, race in relation to Black people in particular. That's what I would love to happen.
Thanks, Barbara. Chris, I was going to say, shall we pause the formal part of it now and move into the conversation?
Let's do that.